Good morning. Hello all, and welcome to day 3 of the 2021 Georgia Accessibility Conference. This event is supported through funding from the Library Services and Technology Act through the Institute of Museum and Library Services and Georgia Public Library Service. I'm Pat Herndon, conference host, and let me briefly share a few reminders. The session will be recorded and archived. If there are other people watching this webinar with you, we'd love to hear about it so that we can have an accurate head count for our records. Please send us an email with the names of the people watching to pherndon@georgialibraries.org. You'll have an opportunity to submit questions for our presenters. Just type them into the chat area. We will have people monitoring the chat. You will receive CEUs for this session and the other sessions included in the 2021 Georgia Accessibility Conference. Now, let me introduce our panel of speakers. Asha Haygood works as the Outreach Librarian for GLASS, Georgia Libraries for Accessible Statewide Services. She raises awareness about GLASS, engaging with the community and fostering partnerships with agencies that serve the visually impaired. She has a background in instructional design in addition to her library science background, and has worked as a media specialist and in public libraries over the course of 18 years. Sean Campos is a library technical assistant at Georgia State University and an advocate for equity, diversion, and inclusion practices in libraries and information centers. Born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and its surrounding communities, she served in the United States Army for 6 years and received her BA in anthropology from Augusta University and her MLS from Valdosta State University. Currently residing in Stone Mountain, Georgia, Sean is currently awaiting the publication of her first personal narrative included in the anthology LIS Interrupted, Intersections of Mental Illness and Library Work. As the teaching and digital projects librarian at Oxford College of Emory University, Vanessa Garofalo leads the library's library's digital scholarship and communications initiatives, as well as provides research support and instruction for students, staff, and faculty. As the chair of the Georgia Library Association's Library Services for Persons with Disabilities Interest Group, Vanessa is dedicated to working toward creating accessible and inclusive library spaces, services, and resources for patrons and staff in all types of libraries. Paige Crowell is a teaching and learning librarian at Oxford College Library. She graduated from Emory University with a BS in environmental science and earned her MS in library and information sciences from the school at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Paige is passionate about critical librarianship and pedagogy, anti-racism and ableism in libraries, and engaging learners on their terms. Kim Eccles has served the GLA as second vice president for membership and as past chair for the Library Services for Persons with Disabilities Interest Group. She is past chair of several ACRL committees. Kim is director of the Swilley Graduate and Professional Library for Mercer University. She obtained her master's degree in library science from CAU and was currently accepted into the Doctorate of Education program at Mercer University. Ladies, take it away.
All right, so hello everyone, and thank you for attending our session today on resources and recommendations for accessibility. So again, I'm Vanessa Garofalo, and I am the current LSPD chair this year. And before we get started, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of how our session is going to be structured today. So these are the topics that we're going to be covering. So we're talking about legalities, mobility, vision and hearing, neurodiversity, and then at the end, we're going to have about 15 minutes or so for questions as well as open discussion. So we want to know what your questions are about, what we're sharing today, but also we want to hear about initiatives that you have going on in your libraries related to accessibility, or any suggestions you have for us, resources that maybe we didn't share today or in the handout. And you want to suggest those for the group as well. So before we move on to legalities, first we're going to hear a little bit of a background from Asha, who's just going to tell us all about what LSPD has been doing for the forthcoming webinar that we're working on, and just a quick overview of the content today.
You're muted, Asha. Sorry about that. Thanks, Sean. So I'm Asha Haygood, former LSPD chair, current secretary. And one of my missions during my time serving as chair was to create some type of resource that librarians could tap into for best practice guidance with respect to accessibility. And also wanted to help provide something that could give an overview of what kind of resources were at their disposal. Our overarching goal with LSPD is to encourage libraries to seamlessly assimilate some of these accessibility resources and practices into those that they might typically utilize. So last year, Sean Campos did a great survey, which many of you filled out. Thank you for that. And from that, we were able to glean what the information need was. And this webinar was born out of that. The webinar, like Vanessa said, is forthcoming. This is just kind of a preview of what we're going to cover and do a deeper dive into in the webinar. Now we will hear from Kim Echols on legalities.
Okay, needed to unmute. Good morning again. I'm Kim Echols, Director at Mercer University's fully graduate professional library, and also a past chair of library services for persons with disabilities. Next slide. Today I'll cover just 3 aspects of the law. Section 501 that deals with hiring, Section 504 that discusses some things that are needed to comply with education standards, and Section 508 that deals with technology and telecommunications. Next slide. ADA is the governing law on hiring, facilities access, and teaching for persons with disabilities. The ADA applies to all public entities and educational institutions. A person with a disability is defined as any person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits major life activities or perceived as having such an impairment. It does not name all impairments specifically. Next slide. Section 501 pertains to hiring. 501 is a federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against job applicants and employees based on disability. It requires employers to engage affirmative action regulations for individuals with disabilities. Next slide. Section 501 highlights include reasonable accommodation, accessibility, and personal assistance services. And personal assistance services is often listed as PAS, and it also requires oversight of implementation. In particular, hiring employers are encouraged to target recruitment programs that partner with disability organizations, internships. Reasonable accommodation should provide written procedures and written notices explaining denial and how to appeal an accommodation. Accessibility. Employers must tell applicants how to file complaints that violates architectural barriers or electronic telecommunications barriers. Personal assistance services, or PAS, means providing help with activities or daily living like eating or using restrooms. Employers must provide PAS to employees unless doing so would cause undue hardship to the organization. Next slide. Section 504 pertains to education and educational institutions. The regulation covers organizations that receive federal aid and must include reasonable access to programs, effective communication for people with hearing or vision disabilities, and accessibility to new construction that a company or facility may make alterations, then those alterations must comply with Section 504. Next slide. Other aspects and takeaways applies to virtually, 504 applies to virtually every entity in the country except churches and private clubs. Schools that receive federal funds, again, must comply with both Section 504 and the ADA in general. Next slide. Section 508 requires access to information and communication technology, ICT. This means technology developed for use in any capacity or procured for assisting individuals with their job, maintained or used for any purpose that 508 must be in compliance. Next slide. Any accessible information technology system is one that can be operated in a variety of ways and does not rely on a single sense or ability of the user. A visual-only format may not be accessible to the visually impaired, and a system with audio-only output may not be accessible to people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Examples of use includes computers, telecommunications equipment, copiers, printers, software, websites, transaction machines, and electronic documents. And 508 was updated and finalized as of March 2017. Next slide, please. Here you'll see a listing of the resources I used for those previous slides. These are resources on sections 501, 504, and 508. You will receive a handout from us that will also include this information, which includes the website www.ada.gov and also www.accessdashboard.gov. Next, we have Sean to discuss mobility.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sean Campos. I'm the current co-chair of, one of the co-chairs of LSPD. And as Pat said earlier, I work at GSU as a library technical assistant. If you've ever wondered what you can do to help mobility impaired users and colleagues using your organization's resources, you're in the right place today. Next slide, please. Let's see, I'll be giving a brief overview of what mobility impairment is. I'll also touch on some questions to ask when you're considering facility or workplace accommodations and good practices that are helpful for library users and staff with mobility impairments. As an FYI, I want everyone to know that many of the terms that are introduced today are covered more in depth within the resource handout that Kim mentioned. It's available on the Georgia Accessibility Conference's website under the Speaker Info and Presentations tab. Next slide. So the first thing we'll cover is what mobility impairment is. It refers to the inability of a person to use one or more of their extremities or a lack of strength to walk, grasp, or lift objects. The use of a wheelchair, crutches, or a walker may be utilized to aid in mobility. I thought I made the word may bold, but I didn't. But I was supposed to make the word may bold to emphasize that not all folks with mobility impairments use or have these specific aids. But mobility impairment is more than just a definition. It can be an identity for those that seek equity and inclusion so that they can live their best lives just like everyone else. Some people see their mobility impairment as an identity that gives them a positive sense of self and feelings of connection to or solidarity with the disability community. It can be a condition that can be diagnosed at birth. There may be circumstances that affect the way a person lives or works, especially regarding their safety or well-being. And it can also be a challenge for those seeking equity and inclusion in spaces like ours. Next slide, please. So here I've listed some questions to consider while you evaluate your spaces for accessibility. Some of our peers, our colleagues, and even some of us may be experiencing discomfort as a result of spaces poorly designed for the needs of those with mobility impairments. These are just a few questions from many in the Equal Access Universal Design of Libraries Guide provided by the DO-IT, Disabilities, Opportunities, Internetworking, and Technology Organization. And they can help you address some potential accessibility no-nos within your space. Being able to provide equity to those with mobility impairments starts with breaking down barriers that we don't notice because we take them for granted, like just getting into a building or being able to work at a workstation that's ergonomic. Are your events inclusive? Are you asking yourselves like whether or not these questions could be these questions could be a guide for you to help you make your space, as I've said multiple times already, more inclusive. Some of the questions here address whether or not your physical environment and products are accessible to people with mobility impairments. For example, are there parking areas, pathways, and entrances to the library that are wheelchair accessible and clearly identified? Some of these can help you in determining whether the information, resources, and technology you're making available are able to be used by everyone that may need to use them. Like, is an adjustable height table available for each type of workstation to assist individuals who use wheelchairs or are small or large in stature? Have you ever considered whether your events were accessible? Are they located in wheelchair accessible facilities? Is the accessible entrance clearly marked? These are just some of the many questions that you can ask yourselves when working to make your space a more accessible one. Next slide, please. So we all know that nothing's perfect. We'll be discussing good practices in this section instead of best practices because standards, policies, and ways of assisting people with disabilities change constantly. We can always do better. So these tips are recommendations from some of the resources that are being utilized to develop the upcoming LSPD webinars on this and the other topics covered within the presentation. Staying informed involves keeping yourself, your peers, and direct reports up to date on policies, standards, and contacts that may be helpful to library users with disabilities. Communicating more with your university's disability services department, if you're at a university, finding credible resources to share periodically with your peers and direct reports, and ensuring that this information is readily available can have a positive impact on how interactions with differently abled users go. Being aware of simple solutions that facilitate universal design can also positively affect your differently abled users' experiences. This is where awareness of facility standards can come in handy. For tips on assisting people with mobility impairments and other disabilities, you can visit the Association of Specialized Government and Cooperative Library Agencies Library Accessibility Toolkit. And the link to it, I'm actually going to drop it in the chat just so everyone can get a chance to kind of experiment and see what's on there. 1 second. So that's there. That also, the Library Accessibility Toolkit can also tell you how you can be supportive of differently abled users. Tips like making sure displays don't impede access or making sure that all staff know what assistive technology may be available at your institution can be found at that link. I want to express the importance of making sincere attempts at creating spaces that are accessible on more than just a standard level. Just stay informed and be an advocate for yourself and the people in your community. Having wheelchair accessible ramps and designated parking is just the beginning. Make sure the resources you work so hard to make available online are screen reader friendly. I'm not necessarily comfortable with creating these types of resources yet, so I'm going to suggest looking into the resources of organizations dedicated to providing information services to people with disabilities. My colleague Asha's organization, the Georgia Libraries for Accessible Statewide Services, or GLASS, been talked about a lot, apparently, and she's probably going to talk about it right after me. But it's dedicated to providing library services to people with disabilities, and they offer a wealth of resources that can be referenced and used in procuring services for differently abled people within the state of Georgia. Over the last year, libraries have stepped up their efforts to make their spaces, both their virtual and physical ones, more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And I believe that this conference and other similar efforts are a step towards that goal. Thank you all for your time. I hope you learned something in this brief overview, and I'm going to turn it over to Asha.
All right. So I'm Asha Haygood, and I'm going to talk to you about some vision and hearing resources. These resources can be applied in various ways, from just providing them at the point of service, like, hey, I noticed you're checking out large print books. If it's due to a visual impairment, then maybe you want to check out GLASS. Let me tell you about GLASS. To the library utilizing the resources themselves to make programs or services more accessible. So, hey, we're having this program today and we have hearing loop technology available should you need hearing assistance. Or they could just be at the ready, and maybe your library can maintain a resource list that can be accessed at the point of service, and that lists resources that correspond to various conditions. Next slide, please. So the items that I'll present here today really are the tip of the iceberg. There are lots of groups in the accessibility community offering a vast array of services, but the items I present, I hope, are great gateways to other sound resources. So I'll start by giving a little background on statistics related to vision and hearing impairments, and also defining the conditions. The NFB, National Federation of the Blind, who you heard from at this conference, notes that there are several ways to define blindness. Many people regard blindness as the inability to see, or at all, or at best to discern light from darkness. The National Federation of the Blind takes a much broader view. They encourage people to consider themselves blind if their sight is bad enough, even with corrective lenses, that they must use alternative methods to engage in any activity that people with normal vision would do using just their eyes. So I suppose the big takeaway is that there's a large enough swath of the population that rely on some form of visual assistance, even if it's just drugstore reading glasses. And it's far too large a number to ignore or insufficiently accommodate their reading needs. According to the National Federation of the Blind's research, in 2016, the number of non-institutionalized individuals in the US reported to have a visual disability was over 700,000. And in the state of Georgia, the number was over 200,000. And Georgia's numbers were among the highest. As for hearing impairments, the National Center for Health Statistics reports that 1 in 6, or 40 million adults, American adults, acknowledge at least a little trouble hearing. And unlike those challenged by mobility or vision loss, people challenged by hearing loss are often an invisible minority. In talking with many of our patrons, I hear that prior to learning about GLASS or similar resources, they were just resigned to not read as much, or to read using means that weren't designed and developed with accessibility as a guiding principle. So the impact of having these resources available and knowing when and where to access them could be major and incredibly helpful to your patronage. Next slide, please. So here are some visual resources related to reading accessibility that I'll speak briefly about. And I'll note we won't pop out to these links, but you will get a handout with all of these links on it, but we won't pop out to them in the interest of time. After I've shared the resources, I'll share a few best practices for delivering services to people with visual or hearing impairments. So we'll begin with GLASS, who you've heard a ton about during this conference. GLASS is essentially the public library for accessible materials. The services and materials are free and open to the public, more specifically the public that qualifies for the service. And through the GLASS site, you also have access to GLASS RSVP, which is just a small database that's kind of rounded up the vision services available in Georgia. GLASS accommodates a myriad of reading preferences, including Braille, digital, large print, and of course, talking books. GLASS also facilitates access to Bookshare, the next resource. And Bookshare currently has upward of 900 titles. I believe Pat gave a great presentation. They are constantly adding material. And they provide accessible reading material with customizable text. So they do have a text-based element to their service. On another note, we often field questions about options for magnifiers and screen readers for patrons and even staff, because staff, the accessible options should be available to staff as well. And GLASS can talk you through acquiring free options like NVDA, which is a magnifier, which is a screen reader, or adding a magnifying extension to your browser. The next resource is NFB Newsline, the National Federation of the Blind's audio news service. Heard about them yesterday, great presentation. And GLASS does offer accessible versions of many journals and magazines, but NFB provides another layer of service offering access to accessible state newspapers, retail ads, weather alerts. And of course, there's GARS, the wonderful service that you heard about yesterday, Georgia Radio Reading Service. Lastly, there's American Printing House, APH, and they create educational and independent living products for people living with visual impairments. And I listed them here because they can provide large print textbooks if the original book vendor doesn't provide that format, and I found that they oftentimes don't. So this is the only revision resource that I share that does have a cost associated. There's a couple of databases on their website that you can search to see if the large print textbook is already in existence somewhere. And if it's not, then you can proceed with requesting either Braille or large print. And the charge is about 50 cents per page, which, could be pricey depending on how many pages are in a book, but completely necessary for someone who needs it. Next slide. CIDI is an invaluable resource. Their superpower is promoting inclusive design and design that has everyone in mind. So providing accessible content and also educating folks on how to make their content more accessible. I positioned GLASS as the gateway to reading accessibility. I'd say CIDI is the gateway to resources on accessibility for content and design. When you get a chance, check out their COVID resources on their webpage if you haven't already. They have free webinars, accessible PDFs that kind of give informational and instructional info on COVID. So it's already kind of, made accessible for you by the leaders in the field. So check them out. The next resource, 3Play Media, it provides information on ADA requirements for accessible media and gives tips for creating accessible video. There are some oft repeated tips on there, like make sure that you do closed captioning for hearing impaired viewers. But there are also some lesser known tips, like make sure you're using a media player that has keyboard operable controls to accommodate people who can't use a mouse. I'm going to drop a link for this next resource in the chat because I included the wrong link on the handout. But this is a great resource from the University of Washington to help do your own captioning. Because yes, platforms like YouTube do caption for you, but like we heard Marty spoke so eloquently yesterday about, they're often not accurate. And this site has guidance for adding captions to videos, Facebook videos, Zoom, YouTube, you name it. So I'm going to drop that in the chat. As for programming ideas, I wanted to add this resource from the Paths to Literacy website, because it's full of information related to teaching children with various needs, from vision to mobility, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, those teaching methods can translate into library programming. They have a blog there on their website. There's a tab there called strategies, where they share strategies related to Braille, deafblind, ESL, just all sorts of various needs. And again, they could be applied to creating programming or additional program accommodations for people with visual or hearing impairments. Next slide, please. Lastly, here are some resources for hearing impairment. Again, we'll start with our gateway resource, which I chose the Georgia Center for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, GCDHH. And it's a hub of resources that offers advocacy and assistance for folks who are hearing impaired, their families, and the community at large. From their site, you can access other resources like links to interpreter services and video relay services, which we heard a little bit about yesterday. I've also included a link to a hearing loop resource. Hearing loops are technology that essentially it's a loop embedded in the floor, and there's a what is it? It's broadcast through to a signal. A signal is broadcasted to I made a note here, I'm sorry. It magnetically transmits sound to hearing aids and cochlear implants, T-coils. And I've been to libraries. I've been to libraries in the Fulton County system that have actually had this accommodation available. I don't know how they acquired it because there is a cost associated. But you know, having that included in at least one meeting room in your library is an example of inclusive design. Next slide, please. So here's what applying some of those resources might look like in action. And bear in mind that applying accessibility support is not an exact science. So no matter how hard you try, there's bound to be some aspect of it that doesn't completely work for everyone. I say as long as you approach offering accessible accommodations with flexibility, respect, and the best intentions, then you're off to a great start. So we'll just quickly go through these. Actively listening and thinking about what kinds of resources might be helpful, asking the patron if you're on the right track, reaching out for help if you need to. GLASS is available in a consultant capacity, providing resources in appropriate formats. So of course you obviously wouldn't provide a small print resource to a person with a visual disability, a visual impairment, or a strictly audio resource to someone who was deaf. And as much as possible, make sure that the solutions you suggest are low or no cost. So now we will hear from Vanessa and Paige on neurodiversity.
Hello, everyone. So again, I'm Vanessa Garofalo, LSPD chair, and we're going to be going through some information about neurodivergent patrons and staff. So we don't want to forget about our staff. And first, I just want to give a little bit of background information. So neurodiversity, it's a term that you may not have heard before, or you may not be very familiar with. So it's actually coined by Judy Singer in the late 1990s. And Singer is an Australian sociologist, but she's also on the autism spectrum. So just last year, Neurodiversity Hub has a quote from Singer on their website where she was seeking to kind of further explain neurodiversity. So she's quoted as saying this: "Neurodiversity is a state of nature to be respected, an analytical tool for examining social issues, an argument for the conservation and facilitation of human diversity." So neurodiversity is dealing with the fact that it is very normal that there's a lot of diversity within the human population for cognitive function. So no two individuals think and function in exactly the same way. And so that's a fact. It's something that is very normal. And we need to keep in mind that there are different individuals who identify as neurodivergent. So here is a definition, several definitions from Merriam-Webster.com. And they say that neurodiversity is first individual differences in brain functioning regarded as normal variations within the human population. Second, the concept that differences in brain functioning within the human population are normal, and that brain functioning that is not neurotypical should not be stigmatized. And Paige is going to define neurotypical for you all in a moment. And then last, the inclusion in a group, organization, etc., of people with different types of brain functioning. So again, raising awareness of this diversity that exists within the human population and making sure that we're being careful to provide reasonable accommodations for individuals, both again, staff and patrons in our libraries who identify as neurodivergent. And keeping in mind that a lot of times the default is to design spaces and programs and have, staff spaces set up and work hours and things like that that are designed for the neurotypical. And that's really putting staff and patrons at a disadvantage. So we need to be keeping in mind that, there are certain accommodations to consider there. So here are a few common examples of neurodivergence. This is by no means an exhaustive list. These are just some common examples that we want to highlight for you today, but just know that there is a lot of diversity in and of neurodivergence itself. But here are a few that I want to highlight for you. So first we have ADHD. ADHD is a disorder marked by an ongoing pattern of inattention and/or hyperactivity, impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. Next, we have autism. Autism is a developmental disability that affects how we experience the world around us. You may be familiar with the term autism spectrum. Next, we have dyslexia. And dyslexia is a brain-based type of learning disability that specifically impairs a person's ability to read. You may have also heard of dysgraphia, which impairs a person's ability to write. Next, we have dyspraxia, which is a disorder characterized by an impairment in the ability to plan and carry out sensory and motor tasks. And then the last category is anxiety disorders. These include generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and various phobia-related disorders.
Thanks, Vanessa. So I'm Paige Crowell, as mentioned at the very, very beginning. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I have never been a chair of the LSPD interest group, so I might be unique in that, I'm realizing. I'm going to talk a little bit about neurotypical. So as Vanessa mentioned, there are many, many conditions included under the umbrella of neurodivergence. So for a while, when Judy Singer first introduced this term, it was mainly used to describe autistic folks and highlight that autistic brains don't function abnormally, but differently. However, over the years, its meaning has expanded out to cover many variations in thought and behavior. So there are countless ways to be neurodivergent, and the idea is that it's diverging from the typical, or what societal expectations of the typical brain are. Obviously, nobody is perfectly normal, but we do use neurotypical to describe folks whose brains are functioning in line with these societal expectations of mood, learning, behavior, and personality. Autistic educator Nick Walker wrote on his blog Neurocosmopolitanism in 2014 that neurotypical, often abbreviated as NT, means having a style of neurocognitive functioning that falls within the dominant societal standards of normal. Neurotypical is the opposite of neurodivergent. Neurotypicality is the condition from which neurodivergent people diverge. Neurotypical bears the same sort of relationship to neurodivergent that straight bears to queer. So there's no inherent positive or negative connotation to neurodivergent or neurotypical, but we must acknowledge that neurotypical folks don't face many of the same obstacles neurodivergent people do. This is a privilege, just as white people have the privilege of not facing many of the same obstacles people of color do. We never want to diminish the real challenges we experience living with many of these conditions, simply to highlight that social expectations are an important factor in this conversation. Next slide, please. So I've included this quote from Alana Coubier and Julia Starkey's article, Access is Not Problem Solving, Disability Justice in Libraries, because I feel it perfectly sums up why libraries should be part of disability justice and by extension concerned with neurodivergence. As librarians interested in equity and justice, we do not want to perpetuate an ideological system that naturalizes the inclusion of some users and the exclusion of others because that is the way things have always been. When we think of disability as a problem to be solved or limit our thinking to ADA compliance, we miss opportunities to understand disability in more nuanced ways and think more broadly about what creating accessible, inclusive libraries could mean. So some people sometimes think, this is a lot of extra work on top of ADA compliance. Maybe I should be just prioritizing ADA compliance and things like that because, I have limited time and resources, but we want to argue that approaching disability justice holistically in your library is what's really going to bring the best services to your patrons and the best experience to your employees. So considering all of the conditions that people are living with day to day. Next slide, please. So with this in mind, let's discuss some of the best practices we can use to make our libraries more accessible and inclusive. Or as my colleague Sean mentioned, good practices. I like that a lot. We can always be striving to do better, and part of that is keeping on top of changing understandings of the world and the needs of the people around us. The first and most important thing, in my opinion, is to include neurodivergent voices in our work, in the planning and discussion of initiatives, in research, on our teams and committees, in the design of our spaces, and in the assessment of our patron satisfaction. Nothing about us without us has been the rallying cry of disability activists since the 1990s, and it's still true today. If you're considering an event or policy that will affect disabled patrons or staff, you need to be including their voices in your planning and discussion. Next, avoid like-me bias. So someone may not think or communicate the same way you do, and that's okay. See this as an opportunity to reconsider what we see as normative in terms of behavior and the workings of brains. And whenever possible, offer a variety of spaces to work and study in, both in groups and alone. For example, this may be as simple as designing designating a section of the library as a quiet space, or a section of your work environment, like your office. Next slide. I've also listed just a handful of recommendations that I've drawn from this article by E.E. Lawrence, a librarian on the autism spectrum. This article he published in 2013, Loud Hands in the Library, Neurodiversity and LIS Theory and Practice. So some of you may be familiar with the concept of quiet hands, which is often told to autistic children. And the rallying cry for autistic self-advocates is loud hands. So he suggests considering sensory needs and space usage in your library. So for example, fluorescent lighting may cause headaches for patrons with sensory sensitivities or patrons who are prone to migraines. He also mentions that open learning commons environments may be helpful to some users, may help them feel welcome in a very open and airy space, but it can prove intimidating or overwhelming to others who have anxiety problems. Next, remove ableism from our work. We need to engage in anti-ableist research and educate neurotypical colleagues and patrons about neurodiversity. Most of the research done on neurodiversity in libraries is done with the assumption of neurodivergent children, mainly autistic children, patrons, and neurotypical library staff. We need to critically re-examine that narrative and approach our research on neurodiversity in the library with a non-paternalistic lens. Next, improve the accessibility of our hiring practices and work environments. So Lawrence said, if librarians are to truly embrace neurodiversity, they must cultivate the requisite knowledge and sensitivities to make the profession safe for a wide variety of persons who present in a range of different ways. We're aware of the lack of diversity that exists in libraries on many fronts, and we need to make a concerted effort to change this by providing opportunities and support for all kinds of folks to join the profession. And lastly, outreach is imperative. So collaborate with organizations that support neurodiverse people and get involved. And under this recommendation, I would also like to include the reminder to consider intersectionality in our work with disabilities. Kumbier and Starkey wrote that if we only involve white people with disabilities in our collaborations, we will not develop approaches to access that respond to the different histories of oppression, contemporary microaggressions, and other practices that privilege some groups and assume the benefits of privilege that accrue for members of those groups over others. Remember that disabled folks of color have had different experiences than disabled white folks. Class, race, gender, sexual orientation, and other factors apply to the lives of disabled people just as much as they do to non-disabled people. And sometimes that's in the same ways, sometimes it's different. Never assume you know what someone's experience has been like. Always invite them to share their needs with you and do your best to meet them if you can. Next slide, please.
All right, so I'm back to share some tools and resources with you. This is just a sampling of what we have included on the presentation handout, which is available on the conference website currently. And we'll be going into a couple of these resources in more detail in our forthcoming webinar, but it is linked in the slides here, and we do have them linked in the handout. But the first one that I want to highlight, the quote that I shared earlier from Judy Singer was from neurodiversityhub.org. This is a really great resource. They're really striving to create a strong community of practice for neurodivergent individuals, for students, for employers, for educators, to really help prepare individuals for the workplace, prepare them for their education, just really build them up to be successful. So there are a lot of really great resources on that website, so definitely check it out. And the next one, Exceptional Individuals, is geared a little bit more toward supporting employers. So we've talked already about the importance of accessibility for both our patrons and our staff, just by providing some accommodations and making a comfortable, supportive work environment for our staff. Ultimately, we're setting them up to be successful and to help our staff to provide even better services for our patrons, because they're getting the support and the accommodations that they need to be able to be more successful. And then the last two are just understood.org and differentbrains.org. So again, those are linked in the slides, so definitely check those out and keep an eye out for our upcoming webinar where we'll be doing a little bit of a demo of a couple of these resources.
Awesome. So in conclusion, if you take nothing else away from this neurodiversity section, we wanted to remind everyone that many conditions and impediments are invisible. So this can be referring to neurodiversity, it can be referring to hearing issues, it can be referring to chronic illness. People can be experiencing disabilities that you may not be aware of. So make space for differences and make your library a flexible and welcoming one. You can do this by asking employees and patrons if there are any accommodations that might make the library more accessible. I really like the strategy because it doesn't require disclosure of disability, but it does open up a conversation about how the library could be a more welcoming space. Of course, no matter how flexible and universal your spaces are, remember that universal design will never eliminate the need for individual accommodations. And individuals are always the ones best equipped to tell the library what they need.
All right, so that concludes the presentation portion of our session. So now we would like to open it up for any questions you have. So questions that you've put in the chat. If you do have questions and want to raise your hand, which I believe that is under the reactions on the bottom of your screen, raise your hand and the admins will be unmuting you so you can ask your questions, but we also want to open it up for some open discussion. So if you have suggestions for resources we didn't mention, ideas, or you just want to share some of the initiatives that you have going on, or even struggles as you're working toward accessibility in your libraries, feel free to share. And we're going to open it up for questions at this time.